Worthy. Worthy to fulfill God's purposes and worthy to share in God's promises. Once upon a time, in a primeval, faraway forest, there stood 3 giant trees, discussing among themselves into what they someday wanted to be made. The first tree said, "I want to be made into a treasure chest filled with gold, silver, and diamonds, and other priceless things." The second tree said, "I want to be made into a giant ship, regal enough to transport kings and queens across vast oceans, and strong enough to make every passenger feel safe, no matter how big the waves." The third tree said, "I want to remain as a tree and be the tallest, most glorious tree in the forest. From every direction and from far away, I want people to see me atop this hill, reaching upward toward heaven as if I were touching the face of God." Many years later, some woodsmen came upon the trees. After admiring their beauty, the woodsmen cut them down. Instead of being made into a treasure chest, the first tree was made into a feeding trough. Instead of being made into a giant seafaring ship, the second tree was made into a small fishing dinghy. For its part, the third tree was simply cut into long pieces, which in a dark cavern the woodsman left stowed away all alone. Being and becoming what God wants us to be is a facet of today's readings that correlates with the fact that each of those trees in our opening story became something that was quite different from what they had wanted to become. Despite what we may ourselves want to become, worthy is what God wants us to become. Worthy to fulfill God's purposes and worthy to share in God's promises. Today's first reading comes from the book of Wisdom, which was written a generation or two before the birth of Jesus by an educated Jew living in Alexandria, Egypt, who was, it is presumed, greatly influenced by, among other things, Greek or Hellenist philosophy. An abiding prescript and concern of ancient Greek philosophy was harmony, an ideal and a value of the highest order to the Hellenists. Harmony, not only in music, but in the universe in general. Harmony is the orderly and mutually reinforcing confluence that exists between disparate aspects of a single reality. This the Hellenists appreciated, but only in realities that the human senses could perceive. The Jewish people, however, held that such orderly and mutually reinforcing confluence between disparate acts of being also exists between concrete realities and abstract, transcendental realities. In other words, those realities that we can't see. There's confluence between those unseen things and those seen things. These realities, which are of God himself and predicative of and demonstrative of spiritual truths, are as real as the former. For the Jews, then, harmony was seen to exist between earth and heaven, man and God. Therefore, we hear in today's first reading that there is nothing in all of creation that God despises, because everything in creation God himself has made. Accordingly, God seeks to bring all of creation into reconciliatory harmony with himself. Said another way, God seeks to make all of creation, including even we sinful human persons, worthy. Worthy to fulfill God's purposes and worthy to share in God's promises. Such worthiness is in today's second reading also a concern of St. Paul. an ancient Greek word meaning presence or arrival. Parousia is the word in Christian theology that denotes that return, which by the time this letter was written, some 20 or so years after the ascension, had not yet occurred. Paul's first concern, then, was to reconcile the historical fact that Jesus had not yet returned with the abiding Christian belief of the time that the parousia was imminent. On account of this belief, some Christians eschewed their temporal obligations, believing that work, for instance, was no longer necessary. Hence, as they watched and waited for the end of the world, some of these Christians simply wanted to become, and actually became, idle bums. Paul, however, would hear nothing of this, and so Paul repudiated such slothfulness and prayed that God would make the Thessalonians worthy of his calling, which is to say, worthy to fulfill in the here and now God's purposes, and worthy to fulfill in the here and now, in this world, that which God has promised. In that same world, the earthly Jerusalem sits about 15 miles to the northeast of Jericho, which is the setting of today's gospel story. In Jericho, sycamore trees were and are plenteous, growing to over 60 feet tall with broadly spreading branches, heart-shaped leaves, and edible sweet fruit. Sycamore fig trees are as baronial looking as the three mythical trees of our opening story, who were felled and made into things unexpected. As we heard in today's gospel, it was into just such a tree that Zacchaeus climbed and clambered in order to acquire for himself a better view from atop the branches as Jesus was passing by below. An agent of the pagan Romans who extorted his own people, Zacchaeus was a sellout. He was a turncoat. And so by the Jews, Zacchaeus the Jew was considered unworthy. However, as we heard, Jesus called Zacchaeus out of his arboresque perch and invited himself over to Zacchaeus' home. At this, something in Zacchaeus immediately changed. By the power of Jesus' presence and words, Zacchaeus finally came to understand the folly of his ways and grasped, perhaps for the first time in his life, that what he thought he wanted to be and what he had actually become was not what he should be. In less time than it would take a woodsman to cut down a sycamore fig tree, Zacchaeus, like many in Israel before him and many after him, finally became something that no one else, and perhaps not even himself, thought that he would ever become: worthy. Worthy to fulfill God's purposes and worthy to share in God's promises. If we were trees, then our roots would consist of our deepest, truest desires. And these, our deepest, truest desires, would be equivalent to God's deepest and truest desires for us. And by means of fulfilling those desires, we too can become worthy. If we were trees, then ours would be branches spreading outward and upward. If we were trees, then what might those branches convey? What should those branches convey? What ought those branches convey? Here's the answer. Those branches of ours, if we were trees, ought to convey our worthiness as a manifestation of our communion with not only our fellow trees, that is, our fellow human beings, but also God. Our nation, our world, all of us and each of us are in desperate need of this fellowship with God, and by extension, each other right now, especially during these times of unbridled division and divisiveness throughout our nation and indeed throughout our world. Such fellowship, such communion, is not only our deepest desire, truest purpose, and greatest promise, but is also the source and the cause of what will someday be our ultimate happiness. In our opening story, the tree that was made into a feeding trough eventually held a child whose mother and father could find no room at a nearby inn. The tree that was made into a fishing dinghy eventually accommodated that same child who, having grown into a man, calmed the waves that beat against it. And the tree that became only pieces of wood was eventually made into a crucifix, set upon a hill called Calvary, on which that same man, Jesus Christ, breathed his last. Each of these trees had finally become worthy to fulfill God's purposes and worthy to share in God's promises.